Hello everyone, today we talk about Castile again, and specifically of the imperial ambitions of King Alfonso X, the wise king, sort of Spanish version of the Stupor Mundi, that still sparks quite of a historiographical interest because of the relative, say, lack of information on the specifics of his decisions, intentions, towards a universal project that definitely was the one of the century. Right, we are in the 13th. The Hohenstaufen are still around, and actually the same Alfonso has a Swabian legacy, right, in his family. But it's also the peak, as we've seen very often, of not just the universal powers, but this grand projects of domination of the Mediterranean, of reunification of West and East, of crusade, right? Just the other day we made a video about Edward I, say early years, the crusades in the Levant. We've seen how he married actually a daughter of Alfonso X. It's the peak of the chivalric, feudal world values, ideas. The Castilians, as we saw yesterday in our video about the Kingdom of Castile, like a general introduction to this medieval power, had just broken through, right, under Ferdinand the Third, like Alfonso X's father, the Al-Andalus. Right, after centuries, of course, of pushes, of incursions, of backs and forths, etc., the Castilians had been leading at this point their conquista, and factually they had terminated it, meaning that the Islamic rulers, as we will see now, including the Nasrids of Granada, had recognized their overlordship. So Castile was quite at the center of a major sort of imperial, at least, enterprise that had invested the entirety of the Iberian Peninsula, that, as we have observed, and we will see in some greater detail in other videos, had, we can say, in medieval times, always had a specific sort of, not just imperial, but universal dimension. Right? We have observed how the Iberian Peninsula was, let's say, much less permeable, say, for example, than the Italian or the Balkan ones, and especially the Castilian continental terrestrial dimension was the best embodiment of that. Right, Castilians at this point had managed to overrun the Mozarab world in say, from quite a while, of course, taking over Toledo, the seat of the older Visigothic councils. At this point, of course, Castile was under the Roman papacy, had adopted the Roman rite from the previous sort of so-called Visigothic one by some degree. So this place is the kingdom in the wake of this full, say, Western expansionism, right? Roman Catholic. One, of course, Castile is the strongest, most powerful, more robust monarchy in the Iberian Peninsula, and together with all this, the other essentially Western ones in Europe, from England to France, the other Iberian monarchies, that are also consolidating, taking shape. It was still somehow functioning systemically in very peculiar ways that somehow also provided with a separate cultural outlook just on the issue. By the way, I made a video about Richard of Cornwall and Alfonso X, of course, regarding the German interregnum, right? And we talked about him not that much, but we were mostly observing German politics during those years. You know that while Richard of Cornwall was the brother of Henry III, right? Made a video also about him. And he actually went to Germany, right? He couldn't do really much there, but because the reason why they would pick an Englishman or a Spanish for the as king of the Romans was, of course, the deal of the German princes to keep this, say, a powerful monarch out. Alfonso wouldn't even go ever to Germany, and as we'll see now, there is all a debate. It was internet regarding what the hell was he thinking in terms of concrete political gains. At least some scholars went as far as saying he didn't know what he was doing. He was a highly theoretical guy, well learned and clever, etc., but not particularly wise. I think that was some general, at least I believe we know, say these guys knew much better their own world than we do, of theirs, of course, and possibly even our own in relative terms, and how to run it, especially. But there are, in spite of possible mistakes, misconceptions, whatever, still valid reasons, after all, for attaining the empire. Right. Today I will not open a parenthesis on, let's say, what did the empire mean at this point, especially during the interregnum. You know that things had gone pretty downhill with the decline of the Hohenstaufen, etc. But as I was saying at the beginning of this video, the imperial mythology there was still very powerful and played by different actors, as we will see now throughout the entire scene. Right, not just in the empire, such as in Germany or in Italy, because it was actually the Pisans, as we will see now, and eventually the Marseillaise in Burgundy. So within the Holy Roman Empire, that called Alfonso, right, proposed him to intervene, like to be a candidate, right? But also things were going on in France, in England, within the same Spain. And of course, with the complicity of the papacy, it was also Sicily in between. This is the time of also Manfred. So not everything has been settled, right? There is still Conradin of Swabia around, and these are all things we already discussed, but we'll come back on also in relation to this. So the question is, why a guy from Castile, right? What kind of political, territorial capacity? Of course, territorial is crossed out at this point, but politically, right, what was the deal with Alfonso's involvement and even election to the Roman kingship? Let's consider also Castile in itself and Spain, right? The capture of Seville, that would become a major say medium for also Atlantic expansion, would be settled by the Genoese. That's where the Castilians themselves organized important expeditions, aside from the northern ports that had already existed, of course. This came together with Cordoba, with Cadiz, etc. We will see it now because specifically Alfonso there had sort of projection towards Africa that surprisingly or unsurprisingly encompasses that idea of universal power and empire, right? And there was a great debate, naturally, about what the new sovereign could really do, especially after the exploit of his father, Ferdinand III, that later on in history would even be sanctified, and that was considered one of the most successful rulers of Castile and of Europe in his time. Because it's difficult to live up to the expectations of such a great and the accomplishment of such a great predecessor, right? And politically, there is always somebody that wants to strip you of power, which is a too dreadfully frequent thing in medieval times, and all the complication, even just of regional issues, as we'll see now. And so especially the bishops of Castile were in this turn in the passage from the death of Ferdinand, the rise of Alfonso, were really wondering whether the soul of this new king was fit for the task, right? And the doubts were intensifying, because today we do not get to the end of Alfonso's reign. It's just about this aspect of his rule. But he, in all his importance and role, etc., was fundamentally a defeated king, right? One that had his own reign eventually slipping away from his hands, all right? Alfonso was, and this is interesting, like while his father was handling a quite tempestuous reign, showing the capacity of holding, say, the mast of Castile, his son Alfonso was spending his life, right, through rather intellectual virtue, right, rather than other, say, practical political insight. There is a debate regarding this, but let's say this guy was really a prodigy, right? Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, considered the greatest monarch of his time, was known as Stupor Mundi, right? So the marvel of the world, also for his scientific interest. Frederick was a very different person from, let's say, and they were relatives, by the way, with Alfonso, but we will talk about it later. But it was a very different individual from him, right? He was also a man of great action, of great cold blood, of rational calculation, and the more you study Frederick, we will keep making so many videos about him, because really every time you dig in the sources about his work, and always, right, something new comes out that we had not considered in the iron logic and fist, by the way, of this man. With Alfonso X, this great premise, but and in part also, as we'll see now, political and even military capacity, that, however, gradually fails. The same. A 13th century Aragonese historiographer actually did style the same Alfonso as Stupor Mundi. He was into science, astrology, astronomy, law, poetry. This was, again, not so uncommon, of course, in this moment of, say, virtuosism of the feudal elite, but Alfonso was definitely beyond his, let's say, most of his contemporaries, and especially in at least we remember him as also a ruler provided with this specific interest, right? And so, in the face of all this promising intellectual background, he would die later on abandoned, actually in conflict with his own family and subjects, even more importantly, arguably. There was some sense of a new era opening, as his father was actually recalling him, right? It was since the time of Isidore of Seville and the Arab conquest of 711 that the Iberian Peninsula had not been under a Christian power hegemonizing the entire area. Castile was the protagonist, as we've seen, of this accomplishment, and this meant that in order to rule over this sort of redeemed system that was really imposant and huge, and again, the spaces here involved, you don't have the time to digress on, but you understand how much was in the hands of Toledo at this point, right? And the impression given Alfonso's shortcoming is that even though he was known as the wise king, El Rey Sabio, in Spain, he was sort of more intellectual than, wise and practically oriented, apparently. When Ferdinand III died in May 1252, Alfonso had listened on his father's deathbed how, in fact, important the aforementioned accomplishment since 711, right? We're talking about more than half of a millennium, right, of Islamic hegemony. What had been accomplished thanks to the support of the church, thanks to the actual military struggle of Castile at some point, was faltering. There were many backs and forths. I mean, the Almohads, the Almoravids, had been moments in which it seemed that the Christian victory could be lost, right? So it was already inherent and evident that the challenge Alfonso was to collect by rising to the throne was enormous, right? People were wondering whether he would have been up to his father's. And interesting aspect is that Alfonso wrote himself a history of Spain, the Historia de España, in vernacular, by the way, that was itself reflecting on these very themes. It is remarkable in many ways, you see, because Western literature was at this point able to just consider, right, such courses of history from a regional perspective as still a sort of millenary one in a sort of very modern sense, right? Not just by imitation or following certain canons, but literally writing here in vernacular, right? By a king's hand and reflecting on the same challenges that were put on him, right? Here it's truly modern in many ways, and this is also testament to Alfonso's intellectual achievements, right? We will see, hopefully, in the future phases of Alfonso's reign. You can say that there was a first one in which he mostly dealt, as we will see now, with Spanish affairs between 1252 1256. After which you have this imperial adventure that so many other rulers had tried to take up. The last period of Alfonso's reign, till, say, from 1275 to 1284, was instead marked by quite significant problems politically. Militarily was a civil war, and especially questions regarding the king's succession, but this is not what we're really looking at today, right? There is no doubt that our, say, knowledge, our judgment, say, the historiographical lens through which we see Alfonso is fundamentally negative, right? There was a sense of classicism also. Alfonso suffered a bit of the Black Legion of the Middle Ages entirely. There were certain Spanish authors of the Renaissance that were complaining about the fact that he could write, in fact, a history. I mean, a king, right? And the King of Castile specifically, you could write a history in vernacular, which seemed outrageous, all right, and opening fundamentally to a sort of phase of ignorance where vernacular would prevail over Latin letters. This is what the historian Juan de Mariana thought in the 90s of the 16th century. And so we have to be careful in the way the same universalistic ideology was interpreted in modern times, because as we know, especially well in this channel, there are lots of things that we were fed in terms of that modernistic, secularistic perspective, that it's not just that, in my opinion, they're wrong morally, but they are actually anti-historical, meaning that if you want to know how a 13th century Castilian king, and king of the Romans, by the way, would reason like, right, you can't quite use these categories. But as we know, important names in literature make also this effect, and that's also something we must appreciate historically, like that those were other times, and they reason differently. We just have to be aware of that. So initially, Alfonso's reign wasn't that bad. Also, in terms of this angst, let's say, that was put specifically on Castilian rulers in a feudal military sense, These were the leaders of the Reconquista. The major military orders of Spain were founded in the what we observed yesterday, this mega Castilian system, including Galicia, Leon, etc. And there is no doubt that Castile had the strongest army, had in fact opened wide the path through Andalusia and obtained the greatest results in keeping fundamentally the other Iberian opponents at their side, right, in that Reconquista effort, aside from all the conflicts. And I mean, Portugal was emerging from a secession, fundamentally from at least a once Castilian dominated area. I made a video about medieval Portugal, by the way, if you're interested in that, and we'll come back on that hopefully. In any case, again, Alfonso was good at this first phase. It was also very energetic, because actually I would say one trait of his personality was really this sort of actually aiming, clear, even fair, loyal sort of action, decision making, etc. Right, and he scored important results on different fronts, right, not just the Islamic one. But this was, of course, particularly important because there were still Muslim enemies down south that needed proper approach. Right. For example, he established temporarily control across the Guadiana, to the southwest. Also, he rendered Muhammad I of Granada, the Nasrid ruler, his vassal in the southeast. You know that Granada would last until the Reyes Católicos in Islamic hands, but as a vassal, right, of these Christian powers, even though plotting with the North African Muslims, right, for re-invasions, etc. We've made a video about the Battle of Rios, a lot, if I'm not wrong. Perhaps I have to re-upload that, but in any case. There was, however, also a Christian front, right, especially in the east, and specifically Navarre, right, because Navarre was historically connected with Castile. Were bordering fundamentally. Castile is, say, if you look at Galicia, Leon, Castile, it's basically going from northwest to southeast in a way, except it's all north enough to be at the same latitude of Navarre that borders the east of Castile. And Navarre was particularly important because, first of all, it differently from the other Iberian kingdoms, its history had not expanded further south, right? At least it had stopped at a certain point because Aragon, Castile became more powerful, and it is by far the most sort of Frankish influenced country. It's on the other side, like it doesn't arrive to the Mediterranean, it's just on the Atlantic, and it borders especially, and it's deeply intertwined in its history with France, right? Not just geographically, but also dynastically, politically, for reasons now we can only partially digress on. In fact, the Castilians that were much more powerful, Navarre at some point had even hegemonized historically Castile, tried to rule it, but eventually this had, say, coalesced as a political unity together with, again, Leon, Galicia, and expanding eventually down south to Toledo. So at this point, the Castilians were sort of coming back, right, and they had a very specific interest, that is, reaching, say, hegemonizing Navarre, and especially reaching the same France, right? They had dynastic, connections with the same Gascony that they sort of regarded on their own. This is something, again, we've seen it recently in the video about Edward I and his marriage with Eleanor, right, Alfonso's half-sister. Alfonso essentially tried to play on the local nobility discontent in both Navarre and Gascony to revive those Castilian claims of suzerainty in the regions. After all, he didn't quite need a conquest, right? he did intervene militarily in Navarre, and this did prove counterproductive, right? Because lots of things going on, by the way, also in international support, because there were literal dynastic claims, right? And various enemies were supported by other dynasties, especially the French ones. The Castilian intervention in Navarre brought the local young ruler Theobald II to sign a strong alliance with James I of Aragon. That was, by the way, Alfonso's father-in-law, because Alfonso had married Violante, James' daughter. The Navarrese-Aragonese alliance, friendship, was, in an anti-Castilian fashion, was signed with at Tudela with the Pact of August 1253. Also by the Treaty of Monteagudo the following year, April. And this can be considered a failure of Alfonso. However, in Gascony, there is a pretty smart move, right? Because, first of all, Alfonso could claim paternal great-grandmother's right to succession. We're talking about Alfonso VIII's Angevin queen back in the day. And Gascony was fully within France. Navarre is a bit more complicated story, but not much for the moment. And even though Gascony was not possible to occupy, because you couldn't Navarre, right, that was in between, definitely not Gascony, but was used successfully as an expendable land for Alfonso's half-sister dowry for the marriage with Edward I. In other words, Gascony was provided, right, as the dowry, right, so the overlordship. And we've seen Edward was somehow connected with this land as well. In practice, thanks to this marriage brokered between Alfonso X and Henry III of England, Alfonso could give away a substantial, royal dowry without weakening the internal resources of Castile in a land that was, after all, relatively away. All right, not contiguous, not making up a bulk of course, of the kingdom, of his kingdom's territory. The latter of which was not to be depleted, and just in resources, etc. And this was an important alliance connection. We don't have time to digress on why this sort of French support to not just French in the sense of the kingdom, but different branches, different houses within France were sort of supporting Alfonso's enemies. He, as we will see now, sought a French marriage as well, a royal one, and the celebration of Edward and Eleanor's marriage took place just outside of Burgos in October 1254. This made Edward I Alfonso's brother-in-law, and such, say, marriages were somehow relevant also for expanding Castilian influence in European affairs, right? You see that the Castilians had understood, quite a bit like also the other Iberian rulers, that it was important especially to connect with France, right? Founding monasteries in France, etc. It was all sort of lost in terms of direct control, etc. But it brought two very important political connections, and was also allowing a faster sort of Francization of Spain, right? It was a full westernization, we can say so. This marriage with England essentially brought also to an increased pressure on Aragon, given that Alfonso's father-in-law, James I, was beginning to feel in the broader international alliances this increase of Castilian pressure. There was, in May 1255, the betrothal to what were at the time the heirs to the thrones of Castile and France. We're talking about Infanta Berengaria, Alfonso's daughter, and Louis, the son of Louis IX of France. Right? Louis, however, died a child, and the Infanta had also a new brother, right, from Alfonso X, which sort of bypassed this, say, Iberian practice, at least, of accepting a female heir, right, in succession. We're talking about, we'll see now, Frederick. The King of Castile, at this point, made that famous step that projected him in imperial policy. In fact, at Soria, in March 1256, Alfonso received some representatives of the Ghibelline commune of Pisa. Right? We have seen how important this Tuscan Maritime Republic was for the balance of the Holy Roman Empire. Made 2 videos about Pisa and the history of Pisa just individually as a commune, and then we kept talking about her role, different other videos. And it was sort of inexorably a Ghibelline power, right? It had always backed the Hohenstaufen, and yet it was also projected on the sea. It had sort of a rivalry with the Catalonians, so this was a meeting point with Alfonso. There were other reasons why this thing was going on. In any case, the Pisan envoys had the official task of proposing Alfonso the candidacy to the imperial throne. This is the beginning of Alfonso's adventure in that regard. The interesting aspect is that the other Castilians had not really contemplated this idea before, or at least it seemed like it required a lot of investment, a lot of money to just win the election, etc. So it was all something that orientatively they were not willing to pay just per se. And this relation with the peasants was fascinating because it connected further the Mediterranean, squeezing the Aragonese in between. For example, Marseille as well had associated herself with Pisa in this mechanism. Historians are still somehow perplexed, however, regarding the broader aim of this imperial adventure, because in my opinion the matter is this, as we will see now, that yes, it was of course impossible for Alfonso to think to rule over Germany, for the simple reason that even if, as it was typical of Central Europe, like the elective monarchies were choosing again external rulers that didn't have to mess with their own stuff and so on, Alfonso was also King of Castile, and of course it had an enormous task just at home. So in my opinion, it's impossible not to see that this was just, some provocation, some sort of grabbing, some sort of, I will do that, right, and let's see what options fundamentally emerge from that, right? The only problem was with which effectiveness, because you could also try to do that, and as Alfonso would be being a ghost king of the Romans, and with a contended title, by the way, with Richard of Cornwall, so even just within same within the same English-Castilian relation that, as we've seen, was not that bad in the first place. But the English were trying. Henry III was similar in that sort of more relatively withdrawn capacity of, however, playing behind the scenes and trying to place various relatives on different European thrones, from Germany to Sicily and so on. Consider that at this point there was a huge Swabian legacy to be recovered. What was to happen to Germany was not entirely clear, because, telling the truth, not even after the Interregnum and the rise of Rudolf of Habsburg, things were, until the beginning of the 14th century, so irremediably compromised for the empire not to just manage to reconcentrate some sort of power. And paradoxically, this was occurring exactly through that savage privatization and sort of political grabbing that could create some impressive systems, even over different countries at a point. Of course, the lack of a, say, centralistic capacity of also control from abroad was rendering this sort of acceptation of the election to the Roman emperor somehow a charade in itself. Plus, consider that there was an empire to manage within the same Spain and North Africa. This is, for example, the reason why a city like Marseille within the Holy Roman Empire would sort of want to see a greater influence of Alfonso, because in that case specifically she traded substantially in the Western Mediterranean, and a further say Castilian consolidation in over North Africa, right, the extension of such imperial hegemony across the strait would have benefited them, also would have rendered the city more autonomous from Aragonese influence. Were all this sort of mechanism, without mentioning that Alfonso himself was playing in on a much more complicated checkerboard, let's say. He say obviously say running for Holy Roman Emperor was, or at least King of the Romans, was a an issue of major intervention on, say, the Ghibelline Guelph struggle in Europe anyway. At this point, Manfred of Sicily, about whom I made a substantial video explaining the sort of the incredibly overlooked relevance and sort of accomplishments, especially in hegemonizing Italy, almost completely under the Ghibelline power, and triggering actually the most acute and truly sort of international conflict between, say, two blocks is a bad word because it wasn't quite such a thing, but at least a more neatly defined sort of, okay, we are the guys who signed with the sort of imperial power in a way, and the others that signed essentially against it. It's not even signing for the papacy, right? It's just being something else. Manfred had his own problems. Himself, he had basically usurped his Sicilian throne from his young nephew, that after his death in Benevent would come to suffer a similar fate in the same Sicily. So Alfonso stepping in such situation, for example, Manfred had married one of his daughters to an Aragonese, and that obviously meant, like, the Aragonese were normally Ghibellines, right, by themselves in that sort of thought, but there would be Castilians as well intervening. Famously enough, at the Battle of Tagliacozzo, actually the French army was broken initially before the ruse that Charles of Anjou had would use actually to win the battle by the same by the same Castilian contingent. So there is really a lot of stuff. This is not what we're discussing, because this is just from a Spanish side of the story, how it looked for Alfonso to do this in the first place. So it was not that much of a sort of simple thing to do, without mentioning that, say, at least running for King of the Romans meant to at least being in potential complicated relations with the papacy, right? That, of course, didn't want, especially at this point, any form of pressure from, especially the Hohenstaufen, that were not evidently defeated yet, right? Pope Alexander IV was not particularly happy of Alfonso's intervention, but he understood also that this guy was not, he was King of Castile, and he would stay in Castile, even if he had ever planned some sort of, I don't know, Italian expedition or whatever, for reasons that, of course, would have been substantially different from the ones of a German ruler, and or the ones of Manfred at this point. It would have played, in fact, as a deterrent for these other forces, right? So the popes remain acquiescent this proposal, because they said, okay, this guy's in Castile, but it's not even Aragonese that can simply say, okay, well, can launch an expedition to Sicily to do something even in an Italian theater, in a grand style, and with the hope of some sort of territorial acquisition, as the Aragonese would do later on with Sicily and during the Vespers, and with Sardinia, in fact, as a Ghibelline power. But everything is swinging depending on, in fact, the set of circumstances, because you understand it has not much to do just with the Guelph-Ghibelline dichotomy. It has to do with the balance of these multiple powers, which is a completely different story. There was also another factor in Castilian dynastic history, that is to say, that the papacy had basically accepted also the Castilian pretensions to the same Hohenstaufen inheritance, right? A key point here is that Alfonso's mother was a Hohenstaufen, Elizabeth of Swabia, right? And there was even an older Swabian connection back in Alfonso's family, which actually not just made him a relative of the Hohenstaufen, because this Elizabeth was the daughter of Philip of Swabia. I made a video about him. Is the guy that contended the throne from Otto IV. He was one of Frederick I's children, so it was Frederick II's uncle, and so it was, you understand there, the common blood. And the same Castilians had, even the same Ferdinand III, right after the sort of Swabian legacy. Because, really, if they had dynastically inherited at that point the titles connected with that house, they could have lived up to the expectations of a continuation of imperial policy. Of course, we know how history went, and it's also, even if it had gone differently in a dynastic sense, it's still difficult for a Castilian ruler to operate from the Iberian Peninsula into that and those other theaters. But, right, Ferdinand III had reminded at the time, 1239, Saint Pope Gregory III, that the baptism of his son Frederick in Spanish, that was, by the way, Alfonso's brother, was the very expression of the Germanic rather than Castilian expectation of, in that case, Ferdinand's late wife's as that was Elizabeth, right, as her universal heir, right? This would bring, by the way, Alfonso to kill his own brother, right? Just for telling you what kind of moral situation we are in, because this was used as a pawn, right, to concentrate into the Swabian expectation, right? And Alfonso wanted that, so that he took out his own brother to do that, and so harvesting that his maternal legacy that quickly, because they hated each other really, and so Alfonso had Frederick suffocated. Interestingly enough, Innocent IV had expressed support on that occasion, as later would Alexander IV. So everybody knew what was going on, as far as there would have been another king of the Romans, and then what would have he done, right? That was yet to be seen. Could have been also used by the papacy to some degree, and after all, the universal powers were meant to cooperate. So if you could adulterate Alfonso's Ghibellinism, that was already pragmatically contained, especially considering the great power of Manfred in Italy, and just the fragmentation of Germany during the same period. Well, you understand that there was something, after all, that could be done from Castile, even if at a distance, really. Plus, we don't have to think of Alfonso being, ill-advised, or just, I don't know, somebody said he was a schizophrenic or an idealist, or he didn't understand what he was really up to, right? Consider that there was also all a spiritual, moral dimension that is difficult for us to understand. Alfonso, for example, had a Byzantine legacy as well, right, from the Angeli dynasty, which is something he was keenly aware, because at some point he had carried out a quite heavy and sort of, serious genealogical survey of all the branches of his family to understand what he could properly boast, right? His Pisan visitors back in the day had, for example, told him that he was descended from Manuel I Comnenus, which was actually not the case. We don't know whether it was flattery, because it was actually James of Aragon that descended from Manuel I Comnenus, or because they literally didn't know that and they made a mistake. In Alfonso's Partidas, we do find the acute awareness of his double ancestral and imperial descent, right? So this was being publicized and used, right, to reinforce, of course, not just his position internationally, but from within the same Castilian basis. There was definitely a capacity, as proven by, for example, his Gascon forays, that the Castilians had the capacity to wage war even outside of Spain, and that was, in a way, and especially again in the south, the most obvious ambition. Even so, right, the overall capacity to manage a European empire was not quite there, at least in the traditional universal sense, through the Holy Roman Imperial election, right? And I personally don't think there is anything strange in having accepted the Pisan proposal. When you look at a letter that Alfonso wrote to his son Ferdinand in 1273, we find written La idea del imperio, que es lo más, which can be interpreted literally as if Alfonso had seen the empire as the most important thing, right? At least this broader idea of the empire, right? This is a novelty compared to his father, for example, and so you have, Alfonso's mindset that we don't have to underappreciated in this sense in sort of the traditional and even theoretical awareness of what the empire consistently was. An awareness of the, first of all, of the duty, right, of Christian rulers to reactivate an empire. Secondly, the fact that the guy had been born and raised exactly in the moment in European history in which these ideas were the strongest, were somehow reaching the highest level. He was aware, as we've seen, of also his Swabian relatives' accomplishments. Frederick II had expressed perhaps the highest level of romanity and still of properly of traditional sense of the rising sun. We discussed this in the video about the Sol Invictus as well. So we don't have to be so surprised, right? This could be a surprise for a modern historian that says, well, okay, well, he was into this. Why? Right? Because the mere point of trying that was following on, say, the footstep of traditional accomplishment. You had to throw your heart beyond the obstacle and always striving for the greatest power achievable. And the King of Castile at this time in history was substantially powerful, properly as a monarch, to cultivate not just in fact royal but imperial ambitions, just by culture, by blood, by we don't know how Alfonso fully pictured this, of course, but it's obvious that there is something about it, something about his own awareness and his own legacy, say, of imperial blood that surely had played a part in this. There is also a mistake to avoid, that is to say, believing that every single letter, for example, was sent from Alfonso's government and authority was just a product, rhetorically, textually, of his own beliefs. For example, there was a letter sent to the newly elected Pope, Gregory X, in 1272, in which there is an incredible boasting and sort of bragging about these prerogatives. And that was not written by Alfonso, however. By the way, Alfonso was not even isolated in this landscape of grandiosity, right? This similar ideas were cultivated by other Iberian monarchs, except he stood out just because he was sort of the most powerful, the most representative, let's say, the one speaking louder out this ideas, right? So there is, in my opinion, again, nothing sort of strange about this. For example, before I said schizophrenia, the Linehan came up with this idea about Alfonso, and I don't believe that was that guy, right? It was merely a fantasist, or just getting into the imperial deal for no reason, or thinking that he literally could become a functional emperor, exploiting fully, I don't know, the rise to a universal power in Europe from Castile. That was obviously not the case, right? But the ostentation and aspiration to the imperial title definitely prove what he was up to, also within the same Spain. We don't have to make yet another mistake, that is considering that such, in fact, different scale of ambition was actually mutually exclusive. For example, James of Aragon, that, as we've seen, had been opposed to Castilian expansionism and of course in its own backyard, and the later Catalonian chronicler Ramon Montaner, we were half a century later, and you know that the guy sort of magnified his own country as well, were likely, say, diminishing the scope of Alfonso's ambition, just for saying, but this guy, is running after the imperial crown just because, after all, he wants to to be bigger in Spain. He can't quite achieve the thing, so he's not really into the imperial idea. This could be true at the same time, right? And these are essentially opponents of Alfonso speaking, right? When we look at the few that we can glimpse from Alfonso's own ideas, can, for example, observe the sovereign account on his communication with the Nasrid ruler in 1262, that suggests actually that he had a much greater universal scope, right? So much so that Muhammad I, Nasrid, is his vassal, and in the sense just conversationalist, was pointing out that there was the possibility for, of course, the Holy Roman Imperial aspirations to be frustrated, that it was still possible to establish a larger and better empire still. And from a Nasrid perspective, and realizing what, as we will see now, the same Alfonso would do in the south of the Iberian Peninsula, this could have meant only an expansion of Castilian hegemony over Africa, right? Which is actually what the same Ferdinand III had advised to Alfonso. And the Castilian king was definitely going toward that direction. For example, by 1262-63, the Taifa king of Niebla, that is close to Huelva in Andalusia, Ibn Mahfuz, had sued for peace to the Castilians. And Alfonso stated at that point that he would have liked, who was willing to bury himself once dead in the recently conquered Cadiz and facing south, which I think is one of the most eloquent evidence of what his broader plans, right, of crossing the Gibraltar Strait really was. In fact, he captured Jerez de la Frontera in 1253, which was a hell of an Atlantic position, as you know, and it's obvious. And there would be attempts later on, of course, of Castile to establish a seaborne power to counter the Muslims at this very point, right? And it was a hell of a problem because strategically, the Muslims actually had the upper hand as far as the crossing was concerned. The crossing of a major army for a major operation, a major invasion. Smaller actions could be carried out, right? Just also in a propagandistic fashion. For example, the Moroccan port of Saleh to the north of Rabat was briefly occupied by Castilian forces that had stormed it in September 1260. And Alfonso had also maintained always the objective of capturing Ceuta, right? Especially around 1264, there was a great interest in taking this African coastal avampost, right? And this would have been Alfonso's course of action, right, if he had not had to cope with the Mudayar, that is essentially the Jewish and the Muslim population rebellion of 1264, which happened quite suddenly, by the way, but not before, after having captured Jerez de la Frontera in a couple of months, to having entitled himself, of course in an optimistic sense, because there was still a lot to conquer out there, nevertheless, quote, King of all Andalusia. So this is a particularly meaningful picture of what Alfonso, I think, was really thinking when it came especially to the African adventure, which evidently shows that he could be playing and also actively in both the, say, Holy Roman Imperial and the Iberian North African front and dimension. And I think this is relevant when you consider what I was saying at the beginning, that is to say, the presence of a true imperial character of the Spanish monarchy, for how it was, and especially Castile, which truly had always had a sort of more warlike, feudal, imperial inclination, especially ever since it had conquered Toledo, right, and basically opened control to the rest of the Iberian Plateau and hinterland, and consolidating, in fact, the strongest Iberian monarchy from there. So Alfonso is definitely a fascinating figure. We will look at him surely in other videos, in other circumstances, because it adds yet another brick, let's say, to the wall of 13th century rulers truly devoted to the objective of universal power, right? In a traditional fashion, in the following century, say, much of this would have practically died out, at least in a practical sense, right? It was possible until the 13th century to really achieve, not in this case really, but some sort of, well, it's debatable. Some say up to the, yeah, somebody could really do, especially the Angevins in this time, right? Not truly as Holy Roman Emperors, as you understand, but, right, if we're talking power, still so. Well, Spain, even after the sort of late Middle Ages crisis, still maintains within it, in its guts, right, this sort of darker, austere, sort of conservative, even primitive to some degree. I mean, if you look at the pastoral dimension, there's this enormous lands dotted with castles, in this enormous areas of frontier that at some point had gone depopulated, etc. You realize it in the concept of the hidalgos, of the militarized gentry at the end of the Middle Ages. What for them, right, still with a mentality that could date back to say the Romano-Germanic kingdom, right? This idea that that world was all within, that Spain had its own connection within itself with North Africa, and of course also with Central Europe, but right in a way that was in that sense much more political and dynastic, I would say, especially monarchic, right? As we will see here, as we have seen here, the after all, it was a dynastic reason that could make Alfonso claim even the Swabian legacy, that could bring, even at that point, to his election to the Roman kingship without, of course, ever going to Germany. So that's another world. I mean, Spain is distant, right? There is nothing. It's completely like the post-Carolingian Europe, even with other boundaries and different development, is something that truly leaves interconnected to a degree that even England in part encompasses. Spain does participate, but mostly it is, especially the continental part, and so Castile to fullest, truly something else. It's a sort of world on its own that shares a lot with the rest, but also has an intimately different structure. And that's something that I think it's very difficult to enucleate. I don't know whether when I make these videos I manage to render the idea of how concrete this is, right? How much that custom, that mindset can shine through, can be appreciated. I don't want you to think that whatever country you discuss, it's basically the same story, and or say that there aren't deep cultural differences. For every context that must be appreciated, for which no history, aside from the events, but probably from the background, can be like one another. Well, for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.